Welcome, everybody. We are now live. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Simone. I am a member of the board of the League of Women Voters in Greenwich. We have a wonderful event lined up for you tonight with some fabulous speakers and a fabulous panel discussion on a topic that's highly important and topical. I want to give you an overview before we start of how this is actually going to work, the logistics of the event. By now, everybody's familiar with how virtual events work and how Zoom works, most likely. So I'm not going to give you a lot of detail, but with the way that we're approaching this today is we plan to have a panel discussion for about 40 minutes with our 4 special guests. We will follow that with a Q&A session for our audience, and that will be for about 15 to 20 minutes. Having said that, I should have started by saying, because this is a virtual discussion, we will be utilizing the Q&A questions, and you can look at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a desktop, you'll see the icon for a Q&A, and you can submit questions at any time in that chat window. If you're on a mobile device, audience members you could look at the top right-hand corner and see the Q&A chat window in that position. We have many people signed up and registered, so we are waiting for a couple of seconds more to give people a few more minutes or seconds actually to log in. We will begin the session in just a second, and I will hand it over to our president, Sandy Waters, to do a quick introduction before we actually begin our panel Q&A discussion. Sandy, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Aya. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's virtual discussion about the power of the women's vote, unfinished business. Our evening is co-sponsored by the Greenwich League of Women Voters, the Greenwich Library, and WNYC Radio. For helping to organize this event, our thanks goes to League members Deirdre Kamlani and Aya D. Simone, WNYC's Karina Greenberg and Molly Hindenburg, and Greenwich Library's Kate Petroff. Many of you will already know that this year is the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the US Constitution's 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Did you know, however, that the League, born in the battle to secure its passage, was actually formed 6 months before? 1920 was a big year. I cannot imagine not having that right to participate in public life. Can you? We are honored to assemble tonight a panel of women from diverse perspectives to inform our conversation. Our moderator, Jami Floyd, comes from WNYC, the NPR affiliate station in New York City. The former host of All Things Considered, she was recently promoted to senior editor of WNYC's new Race and Justice Unit. She is also the legal editor of the WNYC newsroom. In a journalism career that spans 2 decades, Jami has worked on everything from breaking news to exclusives to long-form investigations. She has had the opportunity to interview countless newsmakers, including Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, and former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich, cited by the New York Times for her barrage of hard-hitting questions. Panelist Brigid Bergin is WNYC's City Hall and politics reporter. Previously, she worked as the station's general assignment reporter. She has served as WNYC's first breaking news producer, and in that role, she directed on-air coverage for major breaking news events like the death of Osama bin Laden and Hurricanes Irene and Sandy. She also managed WNYC's dynamic morning team. Panelist Denise Merrill is Connecticut's Secretary of State. A Democrat, she was first elected to the State House of Representatives in 1994, elected as Majority Leader for the 2009 legislative session, and elected as Secretary of State in 2010. She has also served as President of the National Association of Secretaries of State. As Commissioner of Elections for the state of Connecticut, the Secretary is charged with administering, interpreting, and implementing election laws and ensuring fair and impartial elections. And finally, panelist Carol Reimers is in her second term as the current president of the Connecticut League of Women Voters, representing all of us with our state government. From Darien, she represents the League's East Shore. She has also served in a variety of League leadership positions at the national level, and she has stepped up to serve in a variety of local governing roles too, including as current member of Killingsworth Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Commission, and as a past member of the Wilton Board of Education. To any news junkie of this election, it's apparent that the role of the women's vote is pivotal. Many in our community vote as a matter of commitment and habit, but this is not so for everywhere and for all women. We hope the discussion will enlighten and inform the League's commitment to ensure that every American citizen over the age of 18, no matter what their political persuasion, votes every time they have the opportunity, not only this year in a presidential election year, but in off-year elections as in next year as well. I'll turn it over to Jami Floyd. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that wonderful introduction. And I want to say good evening to our audience and welcome to our panelists. And thank you to the Greenwich League of Women Voters and the Greenwich Library for making this event possible at this critically important time for this conversation. When women fought for the right to vote 100 years ago, they likely could not foresee all of the forces that would be brought to bear in the election of 2020, but they were visionaries, and so they clearly understood the importance of the women's vote. Even 100 years before that, their foremother, Abigail Adams, at the founding of our country, wrote to the Continental Congress, quote, "Remember the ladies," writing, quote, "All men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." And foment a rebellion they did, from Sojourner Truth to Susan B. Anthony to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and too many others to name, until we had our precious right to vote. And so tonight we're going to talk about it, the impact of the women's vote historically and in this anniversary year, risks to voting and democracy more broadly in 2020, and specifically, given where we are, how Connecticut is ensuring a safe and inclusive voting process. So let's get started. And first, I'm going to ask each of our illustrious panelists to answer what may seem like an obvious question to this audience gathered here, but it's apparently not obvious to everyone, and that is, why vote? 100 million Americans did not vote in 2016. So why the fight for the right to vote? Why have generations from the founders who demanded that representation of the king to the point of revolution, to the suffragists, to African Americans, to even young people who demanded to be able to vote at 18 if they were going to die for their country? If everyone's fought for this right to vote and yet so many don't exercise it, why is it so very precious? Let's start with our host, Carol Reimers, president of the League of Women Voters of Connecticut. Why is this right so precious to our democracy? And if it is, why are so many people still choosing not to exercise it? Lead us off, Carol.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about how important it is to vote and why people should vote. It's, as you said, it's part of our democracy. Every citizen, in order to participate fully, wants an opportunity to decide who's going to govern them. And this opportunity comes up, once a year. Sometimes it's a state or local election. Sometimes it's federal, like we have this year. And it's absolutely imperative because it does affect our lives. And often we don't think it affects our lives directly, but it really does when we're concerned about taxes or healthcare or childcare and education. There's so many issues that impact our daily lives. And the people who make the decisions about that are the people we would elect. Unfortunately, it's a little hard for me because I'm an avid voter to talk about why people don't vote. But I do think I know from having read people's comments and talked to some people, they're afraid that that vote won't matter or it won't make the change they would like. And so rather than, sort of hope for something that they think maybe isn't going to happen, they don't vote and they don't show up. So I think the more we can encourage people to recognize that it does really have an impact on their lives, I think the more participation we'll see.
Well, let's pick it up there and go to a woman who is spending her life in public service. So I'm sure she too is an avid voter. But pick up that thread. Why vote? And why do you think, Secretary, that so many people do not exercise that right to vote if it is so precious and so important to our democracy?
It is the question I have spent many, many years trying to figure out, honestly. And Carol is exactly right, that of course we here tonight in particular probably all realize its importance and care about it and understand how fundamental it is to have your own representation through your right to vote. But believe me, it is not a commonly held idea out there. For many, many reasons. It's really complex as to why people do or don't vote or do or don't understand the importance of, as I like to say, everybody being at the table. In fact, I was on one recent panel with a group of women, mostly minority women, saying, and their saying was, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, which I think is an interesting twist on that. But when you talk to people, it is, as Carol mentioned, people feel their voice may not matter. And tragically, this is usually people from underrepresented communities, from lower income communities, who say to themselves, well, what has this ever done for me? And they want to know why it matters. And having done a lot of work on this, I'll go back to something we called the Civic Health Index. It was a study we've done several years back now, twice. And we actually, a group of us, and I think Carol, you were on that committee as well, the League and some other civic groups, we set out to figure out what makes people participate or not. And some interesting findings came out of it. We asked people about political things, social things, like, what do you participate in? If you don't vote, or if you do you join associations? What kinds of associations do you join? Are you a member of a church? How many times a week do you have dinner with your family? All kinds of questions. One very powerful thing came through to me from those studies, and it's very simple but profound. And that is, people participate in things when they're asked. I never would have run for office if someone hadn't asked me to do it. I don't think I would have thought it up on my own. So I think there's something to be learned from that. People have to feel that they're wanted to be part of that, let's face it, power structure, which is what politics is. Yeah. And so I think that's worthy of consideration when you think about why people do or don't vote or participate in anything for that matter.
And I've heard this is especially true for women in political life. Men just say they're going to run for president at the age of 12, and not just president of their class, president of the country. But women have to be asked, and maybe that's true of voting as well. Let's turn to my colleague, Brigid Bergin, who's actually in the trenches, as we say. She's speaking with the voters on a daily basis. Tell us what you hear about why people choose to vote, why they bring their bellies to the table and engage in the process, or why, on the other hand, perhaps they choose not to. And your view, Brigid, about why it's important to engage in the process.
So, thank you so much, Jamie. And I think to start with your second question, I have the advantage, being a local politics reporter, to talk to voters about how decisions that are made just down their street are made by those people that they do or do not decide to show up and vote for. I also can point to races where the outcome was determined by just a small number of votes, even though hundreds of thousands of people turned out. You know, if you look back at the Queens District Attorney primary just, you know, 2 summers ago, that was a race that was decided between the current incumbent, who is now District Attorney Melinda Katz, and an insurgent candidate, Tiffany Caban, who came sort of out of the AOC school. And that was decided by about 60 votes, with several 100,000 people participating. That is an election where every single vote was counted, literally, because they had to do a manual paper recount, but also every vote counts. So I think I have the ability to talk to voters about races at that level. In terms of why voters tell me they do or do not participate, the issues, you know, one of the things we know is that election laws differ by state. So the rules for registering and participating in New York and the laws in Connecticut are different. And they can be cumbersome for a voter. In New York State, it was just recently changed that the deadline to change your party affiliation was more than a year before that primary. So there are systematic ways that we make it harder for people to participate, and those differences depend on what state you live in. So, you know, that is one of the frustrations that I hear from voters. There's also the sense that, you know, in areas where there is one party rule, they're a feeling that they don't feel represented by that party. And that's in both of the parties, but that's one of the things that I hear most commonly from voters in local elections.
I want to come back to those impediments that are real and or perceived in a bit, but let's go back 100 years if we can, cast our minds back. I know as 3 women who are very engaged in politics, you're all acutely aware of this anniversary. So let me ask you, Secretary Merrill, as someone who is spending her life in public service, a woman who is spending her life in public service, what would you say the impact was of that passage of the 19th Amendment 100 years ago? Big question, I know, but I think you can take it on. And we have that moment we have in every Zoom. There we go.
All right.
I'm sure you said something brilliant. Say it again.
What I said was, it wasn't immediate. The idea of women voting was very radical, and it's hard to remember that now. It was extremely radical. And it's not that there were a lot of women opposed to women voting, for that matter. And it's not that they didn't think that women had power or had prestige of a kind. They just didn't think it belonged in public life. So it's taken us a good 100 years to make progress at all on the culture of women in politics. And right up through extremely recently, there are still lots of impediments to women actually running for office in particular. Slowly but surely, I think we're addressing them, and more women are running and winning. But at this point, particularly, you know, in Connecticut, I can tell you from the time that I've been in politics, almost 30 years now, it's remained pretty much constant that there were about 25 to 30% at the top women in the state legislature. And so that's still not 50%, is it? So after 100 years, we still have progress to be made. That's even more true of minority women. There were very few until quite recently. So, you know, it would be interesting. Someday I'll write my memoirs about what it's been like to be a woman in politics, but I will say I was preceded by giants. There were women that moved forward the culture of women in public life very dramatically. And there were some significant leaders, not only in Connecticut, but everywhere. And those are the people whose shoulders I stand on, and many of us here feel that way. But it took those leaders to make that happen. And it was a slow progress, certainly even after the attainment of the vote. You know, as I think most people know, women still didn't vote in great numbers right in 1920. In fact, some states still blocked them voting in 1920. So it's been a long haul. We still have a ways to go. That's my
right. And I want to, there's so much there to unpack. I want to pick up on one particular point you made with Carol Reimer about the low turnout in the initial aftermath of the passage of the amendment, the initial verdict being that women's suffrage was a failure because that turnout was low. But there were a host of factors that stood in the way of the women's vote, right? To block the incorporation of women as full equals in the voting process. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I can speak more specifically to Connecticut, but I think it was mirrored in other states, as you noted. You know, I think it was around 20% of women who voted in Connecticut in 1920. And there were, while there was some advances for the women who were wanting to vote, there was also several, I guess you'd say, tests. One was a literacy test. Another one was a morals clause. And another, and also you had to be a longtime resident of Connecticut. So that was discouraging a number of people as well. And you know, we see that as we move forward in time, those tactics, you know, particularly literacy, were used for many, many years against particularly people of color as well. So they were fairly successful tactics that people continued to use to suppress the vote. And I also think, as Denise mentioned, you know, there was opposition. And so the people who were opposed were not going to show up.
And I want to stick with you for a moment, Carol, on this point of voter suppression, because we are hearing so much about voting rights and voter suppression. You know, as an African-American woman, you mentioned Black voters. You know, I'm well aware of that, those barriers to enfranchisement for Black voters, for African-Americans. But I really wonder how many women know about the history you're speaking of, the barriers to voting that women have faced. This notion that women weren't embraced, that there wasn't this rush to the polls. You know, we hear about suffrage, we hear about the passage of the amendment, we see some Hollywood movies, women in long dresses, the romance of it all. And we don't really understand that it wasn't an easy path for women to the polls, that there were battles fought and lives threatened and even lost along the way. Carol, say a bit more about that, because I think a lot of that history has been lost, especially for younger generations of women who perhaps take the vote for granted.
You're absolutely right. The younger women, I think in many cases, as Denise alluded to, that we've had these rights for a long time, and we haven't. And I mean, at that point in time, as there were massive propaganda against women voting, and that women would be leaving their children and running off to vote, and society would fall apart, and women's place was in the home sort of idea. So I think that, and those were truly, important to a certain segment of the society, particularly, obviously there were a lot of men who I think unfortunately, saw the threat of another group of people coming in who might want to have a seat at the table. So, but yes, there was, sort of scandalous cartoons at that time. And we know about the women who were force-fed, as you said, and that's been well documented in movies and things. But But I think even in your local community, it was hard for some women to stand up who wanted the vote because they might be a pariah in, you know, in a very small town where maybe more people thought it was a bad idea.
Brigid Bergin, let me come over to you. You alluded earlier to this, and now ties in well with what Carol is saying. We're still seeing hurdles to voting today, are we not? Tell us a bit more about, you know, whether they're intentional efforts to suppress the vote or just sort of the complicated, convoluted, difficult, discouraging things that voters encounter that maybe causes them to throw up their hands and not turn up or send in that ballot.
So unfortunately, Jami, I think it's a bit of both. Ahead of this upcoming presidential election, there are lots of bipartisan teams of experts who are monitoring, you know, early voting, and as the polls open across the country. I was at a webinar just this past Tuesday where Michael Steele, former head of the Republican National Committee, Wendy Weiser from the Brennan Center of Justice, talked together about how there are currently more than 300 lawsuits challenging in all various ways people's access to the ballot. One of the most, you know, one that they are most concerned with has to do with these ballot drop boxes in Texas, and limiting the number of ballot drop boxes to 1 per county, regardless of the size. Texas is a huge state. And so in many ways, they described it from this bipartisan perspective as a strategy of the Trump campaign and the RNC to try to suppress the vote. And so I think it's important for people to understand that and be aware of that. At the same time, it's also important for people to understand what the laws are in their specific locality, and to understand the deadlines and the dates, because they all vary. And it's part of our job as members of the media to publicize that information. But then it becomes also, there's a civic duty to understand what the rules are for the game where it's being played where you live. And so it's a challenging time for sure.
And we have efforts at WNYC to help people understand. Ask a Reporter. You are one of those reporters, and
Yes.
Voter guides and all sorts of things to help people engage with that civic duty. But let me come back over to you, Secretary Merrill, and really put you on the spot as our resident expert on all things civic and political. Why can't we get this right in America? It just seems nuts. I don't understand. Why is it so difficult? You know, you live in one state, it's one set of rules. You live in another state, it's in another set of rules. You move, if you're a young person and you move from, say, New York to Pennsylvania or California, suddenly you're shut out for some period of time, or it's just a completely different set of rules. The mail-in ballot is so complicated that even a well-educated, sophisticated, or not well-educated, but just street smart person can't figure out where to sign, what to sign. Did I sign too many places? I'm out. It's like a game show. Why? It's like Survivor. So why can't we just get organized, make it, you know, codify it so that nationally it's simple, it's straightforward? Are we trying to make it difficult for people to vote? Maybe the answer to that is yes, Madam Secretary.
Unfortunately, after my 10 years of experience with dealing with officials in other states, the National Association of Secretaries of State meets regularly. I was president of that association for a while in 2016 of all times. And I can tell you, this is is considered a states' right issue. It is jealously guarded by the states, and we end up with quite the patchwork that is made more difficult by the fact that today people are so mobile. I mean, perhaps 200 years ago, it worked because people didn't go very far. And so you would be voting in a town meeting in New England, and you'd be walking down the street to your local polling place, and you'd say, "Hey, Marge, how you doing?" And you go in and vote, and nobody thought too much about voter IDs and all this sort of thing. So I think it's complicated, and I think it is deliberate, and I think it's very insidious, because even from 2010 to 2020 now, there's been a change. When I first came into office in 2010, the issue du jour was, should we require photo IDs in every polling place? And that was, it seemed to me, very deliberately to keep some people out. Why else would you worry about that? At the time, I think the issue was illegal immigration. And that was the sort of solution for many people, that we're going to make sure that none of those non-citizens are going to be voting in our elections. And I think it was just portents of things to come, because now the same sorts of claims that are being made, for example, about fraudulent absentee ballots or voting by mail and all the problems people are citing with it, it's just another version, only it's much more overt. I mean, as I think Brigid said, you know, the Trump campaign has said they are deliberately limiting the number of ballot boxes in Texas as a strategy. So it's no longer under the table, and it varies tremendously by state, and it reflects different cultures in different parts of the country. But I have to tell you, Connecticut, we always pride ourselves in being so progressive and so wonderful, but truthfully, we are one of the most restrictive states when it comes to access to voting. We have more restrictions on absentee ballots, and we have no days of early voting, for example, despite my best efforts and many others, because it's in our state constitution. These limitations are very difficult to change. So it's sort of an artifact from the last constitution in 1818, but it's still, the voting on that subject every time we bring it up is very reflective of different people's points of view. And there are a group of legislators who are reflecting their districts who feel that too much voting by mail is fraudulent, that there's opportunities for people to vote twice or sign on someone else's name or whatever thing they are conjuring up at the moment. I have to tell you, there's absolutely no evidence, as I'm sure you have heard over and over again, that any of that has happened. But that doesn't stop people from being suspicious in this terribly, terribly mistrustful age.
Or saying that they are suspicious if it serves their district. Brigid, since you are on this issue, the vote by mail mistrust, I think, lives large in our region as well. I mean, I should say Connecticut is part of our region, but in New York and New Jersey as well. I mean, this raising questions about absentee ballots is not just a question in Connecticut. That's being raised nationwide, is it not?
Absolutely. I will say, Secretary Merrill, I am jealous of your same-day voter registration. We do not have that in New York, and that is a wonderful thing. We wish we had that here in New York. But Jami, yes, absolutely. Questions over absentee ballots, whether they are, you know, for real reasons or are being exploited to perpetuate this idea of voter fraud, have run rampant in this election. A story that I recently broke, which was a very hard story to report because I knew it would feed into that narrative, was related to absentee ballots that were mailed out in Brooklyn that were mislabeled. The oath envelope was addressed and had the name of a different voter than the entire absentee ballot package had been mailed to.
Brigid, explain what the oath envelope is, just to be as clear as possible.
Absolutely. In New York State, when you receive your absentee ballot package, it comes in an envelope that's addressed to the voter. When you open that up, there is a ballot, some instructions, and then an inner envelope that you will sign and date that has an oath where you are affirming that you are in fact who you are. And then that's where you put your ballot and seal it. And then that envelope goes into an envelope that is mailed back to the Board of Elections. to help with the processing of those absentee ballots, the board had asked their printer, a vendor from part of upstate New York, to print the name, address, and then a voter ID number on the front of that absentee ballot oath envelope. And that's where there was the problem. So I would open it up and I would see, the package would be addressed to me, Brigid Bergin, and then that envelope would say Jami Floyd. And that's when voters started raising the alarm, and it resulted in the printer having to reprint 100,000 ballots and mail them back out to voters in Brooklyn. It was caught early, and these voters now are going to be able to vote with corrected absentee ballot envelopes, but it was something that was seized on by the president, who tweeted about it. And it is something that feeds into this idea that there could be problems with absentee ballots. In this case, there's no chance for fraud, because even if a voter accidentally returned one of these misprinted envelopes, it would be automatically voided because the signature and the name on the envelope wouldn't match. So if anything, the risk was disenfranchising voters, not voter fraud. And yet it's probably the last thing the New York City Board of Elections or any New York elections officials would have wanted to happen, given the current climate. And we are seeing all sorts of challenges to absentee ballots, whether it's about witness signatures or other issues across the country. And again, it's one of the issues that when it comes to looking at potential litigation around results, that's one of the things that some of the election lawyers who I've been talking to are most concerned about. So it's not a New York specific issue. It would not be a Connecticut specific issue. It's all amplified and exacerbated by the pandemic, given this huge volume in absentee ballots that are being used in New York. Voters are only allowed to use these absentee ballots because of a law that was passed to accommodate this public health crisis. But it's going to make for an interesting November 4th, 5th, 6th, and so on.
Carol, I want to come back over to you because I heard you loud and clear when you said that women did not flock to the polls in Connecticut immediately after the passage of the 19th. But I also heard Sandy say that the leak was founded, correct me if I misheard, in advance of the passage of the 19th Amendment.
It was.
Which is exciting. So I want to ask you to walk us quickly through 100 years. No,
okay.
I want to know the impact of the women's vote in Connecticut then and now. I mean, the impact of women in 2016 and now in Connecticut must be hugely significant.
Yes, it is. And women wanted instantaneously to work on issues, and actually that's one of the reasons that the League of Women Voters was founded, was to give women a nonpartisan opportunity to work on the issues that they cared about. And in fact, in Connecticut, one of the issues that was that we worked on very early was allowing women to be on juries, to sit on juries, because they had not been allowed to do that before. And then as time went on, I think those issues that women are passionate about and care about, has led us through the 100 years, all the way up to, the most recent time when I think everybody has seen nationally the passion and excitement of women wanting to participate. And not only maybe they started out with just working on an issue they care about, but then they have, as Denise noted, started becoming interested in serving in a seat in government. And so I think that, women have always cared about many issues and have felt at times that those issues were not brought to the table to be discussed. And so, they were fighting from the sidelines, and now I think we're seeing a wonderful benefit of more and more women wanting to directly participate in their government.
I will mention that I attended the women's campaign school at Yale
Yes.
about 2 years ago, I think it was. And it was 120 women of both parties and some independents. And it was a wonderful feeling to be in a room of almost entirely women. I think one man stepped in at one point, and he was welcomed, but it was very exciting to see women gathering around not just partisan politics, but really around the idea of public service. And we were in Connecticut. So that, I thought I'd mention that. It was a wonderful week.
It's an excellent program that Yale has. And you're right. I think it excites us all. I think that's why we're seeing a lot of young women getting more and more excited, because they see, you know, they feel this energy and they want to make a difference and really have an impact on their community and their country.
Well, let me ask a question about young women, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience. Since you mentioned young women, Carol, I will ask both the secretary and my colleague, Brigid Bergin, who may have very different answers to this question, but what do you see the impact of young women being in this election coming up? Obviously, we have the presidential election, but we always focus on that. There are so many other issues and down ballot races that are affected by our vote. So why don't I ask you first, Secretary Merrill, and then Brigid, you're out and about. You can tell us, what do you think the impact of young women voters will be? First, let's ask you, Secretary, about in Connecticut, where you think the young women can have an impact at the polls.
Well, we are seeing record numbers of 18 to 24-year-olds register to vote and vote, both in 2016 and again in 2018. This is the first time we've seen this in many, many years. I'd say you'd have to go back to the 70s to see this kind of a surge in young people actually getting involved. And a lot of them are young women. Since Connecticut doesn't really track gender when we look at voter registration, I mean, we ask people to reveal it, but we don't have significant, solid numbers on that. But I do think that a lot of the activity that's transpired since 2016, a lot of women are associating. There are lots of groups that have formed that are women's groups. People know about the march, but a lot of them are young people. And that is, again, the first time that's happened in a long time. I have to just have an aside here. I was one of the founding board members of the Yale campaign school.
How exciting.
Yes,
Thank you.
Way back with that school. But also there are other groups that have come together. There's a group called Emerge, which is a training program for women to be running for office. And again, women do face barriers. The biggest barrier is getting out there and raising money, for example. I mean, and I'm sure you heard about some of that at the school. We used to teach how to do fundraising, how to present yourself publicly, that sort of nitty gritty running for office stuff. But it's still very foreign to many women to put them out there on a public plate like that. I think these younger women are much less concerned about that. And a lot of them are looking, there's a lot more mentorship going on. I mean, I know myself personally, many of the women who have come through my office as aides, there are a lot of other jobs to do in politics. Right. One of the things we stressed at the school, you don't have to run for office to be involved. There's lots of other things that you can be doing to be in public service. But there's a lot of mentoring that I think is bearing fruit. And I know many of my colleagues have really launched a lot of young women into being involved in their local communities. And that has been terribly important. It's almost like we're at the next generation of this kind of movement. And I do feel that there's a special kind of lift to it this year.
And Brigid, how about you when you're out and about talking with women, voters, candidates as well, but voters in particular? What do you think the impact of their vote and engagement will be in this election cycle?
Well, if we are to have any faith in polls after 2016, the gender gap between Donald Trump and Joe Biden is astounding. A 16-point lead, a 16-point gap for Joe Biden among women voters. When I talk to voters, some of the most engaged and savvy are young women organizers who have grown up with the digital tools that are now standard parts of campaign warfare. And that is, that is how they lived and breathed. And so they are completely fluent in those strategies and in those ways of communicating and in those ways of engaging and organizing their peers to be involved. We certainly saw that in previous elections, in 2018, in some of the midterms and some of the new faces that ousted long-serving members from Congress on down. I'll give my second name check to Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, only because I was one of the first reporters to cover her, and I was out with her as she was registering voters in Corona Park in Queens in September of 2017 to meet this deadline for changing your party affiliation, which was earlier than any other state. And she understood that one of the advantages she could have as a brand new incumbent, a brand new candidate against Congressman Joe Crowley, was to bring more people into the process. So one of the things you see with these young women and these young women candidates is they're not relying on calling the same triple prime voters who get called every election and asked to turn out. They recognize that what they need to do is to get those people who maybe were confused about how to register in their state, or maybe had never been asked to participate and told that they had that right to come in and participate. So I think even in New York State, in our state legislature, 2019 was a record year for women legislators. We're still not at a 50-50 makeup by any means, but among those new elected lawmakers, you saw this crop of young women who took seats that had been held by men for decades and are really changing the makeup of our legislative bodies, and then as a result, changing the type of legislation that gets passed. So we see a lot of change.
I do have questions from the audience, so here we go. This one is for you, Secretary Merrill. Do you think it's plausible, this picks up on one of our previous colloquies, do you think it's plausible to add an amendment to the Constitution? I think this would be the US Constitution, guaranteeing every citizen the right to vote. I think we kind of have that, but moving on. This would eliminate the patchwork job done by the states concerning voting rights and regulations. So I guess I would amend that a little bit to just ask you, is there a way to eliminate the patchwork job done by the states? Picking up on your thought earlier that our federalism has been frustrating from the start when it comes to voting in this country.
Right. The problem comes in that the Constitution also gives the right to the states to regulate elections. So you'd have to overcome that. But honestly, there are moves in that direction now. House Bill 1 last year, put forward by Democrats, would standardize many things. Among other things, it would standardize, I think one of the proposals was to make Election Day a holiday, but that's one of the more popular ones. But there were also things like there would have to be early voting in every state. That would certainly help me out because that would probably override our state constitution. There were also other proposals in House Bill 1 that would streamline and standardize elections across the country, largely, I think, in a very good way. I mean, as you pointed out right from the beginning, the patchwork has gotten a little out of control. There are reasons for it. Every one of those processes that we talked about, like all those envelopes and the signatures, are all there to protect against fraud, and they're put in place over time by various legislatures and legislative bodies, and they just kind of grow over the years. So I think there is a certain amount of almost like bureaucracy to elections now. And it's hard for us to remember. I mean, I've been a proponent of something which sounds radical, but actually I almost passed in Oregon, or may have actually passed. When someone turns 18 and they're a citizen, they're just automatically a voter. Why should we go through all this process of registering everyone and being so concerned about exactly what kind of ID you produce and where you live and so forth? So I would like to see us move in that direction. I think it's more profitable to think about doing it statutorily. I think that could be done without removing the entire authority from the states, just override some of those things.
Automatic voter registration, that's radical, Secretary. Carol, here's one for you. If the Equal Rights Amendment, and this is a parenthetical not being added by me, but by our audience member, currently being held up on a technicality by Barr, Trump, and McConnell, close parens, got ratified, do you think it would increase the numbers of women who vote and run for public office and hold public office?
That's a really interesting question. I have to actually say, while I think it, you know, I'm a great supporter of the ERA, and I think, you know, hopefully one day it will be codified, but no, I actually don't think that would have a different impact. I mean, I think, you know, as I said before, I think really what drives people is whether they feel that something, you know, voting will have an impact on them and on their lives. So, well, I think women would feel better to know that they were, you know, it was in the Constitution, but I'm not sure that it would really affect the number of people, increase the number of people who are voting.
And Brigid, one for you, which is going to be a challenge, I think, to answer. I plan to vote by absentee ballot. Now, this is probably a Connecticut person because we are in Connecticut, but I'm going to throw it to you anyway, and then maybe our secretary or even Carol want to answer as well. Will the results of the election be announced only after my ballot is counted? So my absentee ballot is counted, or are the results going to be announced just from the machine results? In other words, are we going to wait until the absentee ballots come in before the results are announced, which I think a lot of voters really want to know. So
Well,
maybe Brigid, you can answer that generally, since that's a question we discussed on our call today. We had a WNYC election reporting phone call, and we had this very conversation.
So I'll start to answer, and hopefully Secretary Merrill will jump in, but what we will know on election night are the unofficial election returns. That's what we know on every election day, actually. What the difference will be in this year is because there's such a large volume of people voting by absentee ballot, that particularly in states that have granted exceptions or created rule changes to allow people to cite COVID-19 or the risk of contracting COVID-19 as a temporary illness that would allow them to apply for an absentee ballot, we are anticipating seeing a tremendous volume of absentee ballots. I can tell you for New York City, the New York City Board of Elections has already processed 740,000 absentee ballots. That is just the ballots that have gone out. We don't know how many have been returned yet, but that number is 2 times the number of absentee ballots that were counted in all of the elections in 2016. So the presidential primary, and the congressional primary in 2016. So, you know, we are dealing with something that is of a magnitude that many states have not dealt with before. However, we will know something based on the margins that we see in those unofficial returns. And the elections will not be certified, meaning the count won't be completed until they do count those absentee ballots. But we will know something on the day, on election night and on the subsequent days as more ballots are coming in.
Secretary, you agree with that? We'll have an indication on election night, sort of like exit polls, give us an idea of what's going on, and then we'll keep counting.
Right. I suspect that the media will declare the results in Connecticut for the presidential election by about 8:15. But that's, you know, it depends which race you're interested in. I think the presidential race, you know, is not going to matter that much, in the sense that it probably won't be that close in Connecticut. I mean, you never know, but the legislature in Connecticut, it's very much a mirror image of what you were saying about New York. But in Connecticut, the legislature did pass special legislation allowing for more time for all ballots to be counted, up to 96 hours after the election. And we have very strict rules in Connecticut. We do not count any ballot before, in this case, 6 a.m. on election day.
Oh.
So again, you are going to have a tremendous volume of absentee ballots to count. And so it goes back to the fact that there are fewer contested elections these days. A lot of seats are, you know, very heavily one party or another. And those races may make a difference. But exactly what Brigid said, these are unofficial results at best. There are always changes over the 2 weeks in which we actually certify the results of elections. And that's when all this comes into play. So I would just say everyone needs to stay calm and remember that what's most important is that every vote is counted and counted accurately, because we need to maintain faith of the public in the results. And that is not done through speed, quite frankly.
And that takes me to where I want to finish. And I, being a broadcaster, I'm always mindful of the clock. Aya is back. So in a word or two each, how do we maintain that faith in the process? Let me start with you, Brigid, then Carol, and then we'll finish with you, Madam Secretary. Brigid Bergin.
I think we maintain our faith in the process by explaining the process and trusting the experts who are administering it. And as reporters, when there are mistakes, explaining them, but also explaining the solutions so that voters understand what's happening and they don't feel blindsided.
Carol.
Yes, I would add, I think trust is the right word, as Brigid used, because I think we need to keep that trust in the people who are working on the elections. They care as passionately as we do about having successful, safe, secure elections for the most part. And so I think, we just, we're saying patience and trust. I think those are the two words I would use.
And Secretary Merrill.
Well, and finally, I think we all should realize there are forces ranged against us in this election that we have not had in the past. No one has talked yet tonight about the cybersecurity threats that we are under. And I think that those two things are related, and the incredible misinformation campaign that is producing a lot of this distrust out there. So I think, again, you are back to education, information. We are mounting a very large PR campaign to inform people about the things. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. I mean, it's easy to say that, but the truth is a lot of it is being generated from sources that you cannot imagine. So I think that is what's different. I think everyone in America has really had traditionally a rather touching faith in their elections. And really, it's only the last decade where this has become a huge problem. So those of us in public service, those of us trying to manage elections, are up against some really challenging things that we're all trying to do the best we can, and that if everyone can work together, communicate, be as transparent as possible, I think that will make a difference, and make sure that we bring back civic education. I can't you know, I've been on this crusade for years. I'm not sure I've made any progress, but you know, nothing like a little more education out there in the public about how all this works and why. I think it would go a long way to solving some of this.
Thank you. And Aya is back, and I will hand it over to you again.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, everybody. What a wonderful conversation. There's a lot in there, and I got a lot of interesting small bits, but there's a lot more to talk about, obviously. Thank you, everybody, for being with us as audience members as well. We'd like to thank our partners, WNYC, the Greenwich Library, and LWV CT, for being part of this fascinating talk. I'd like to thank our actual individual panelists, Jami Floyd from WNYC, Brigid Bergin from WNYC, Carol Reimers from the CT League, and of course, Secretary of the State of CT, Denise Merrill. Thank you so much for this really fascinating conversation. And ladies and gentlemen who are in the audience, if you liked what you heard today, we encourage you to go to visit the websites of our partners, WNYC online and also television and radio. We encourage you to visit our state sites. Denise Merrill has a website that is very informative, particularly now in terms of whether you're registered, whether your vote for a ballot has been received, and much, much more information. So please visit that website as well. And of course, if you like the events that we have been putting on for you, we encourage you to visit our website, lwvgreenwich.org, and check out the upcoming events that we have. We have a lineup of 2 more things this year. And one of them is a candidate debate for the 4th Congressional District, which will be on October 18th. And in line with what we were just talking about, we have the 4th annual Harvard Case Method discussion. And Denise Merrill will be interested to know that we are doing our best to bring back civics through this particular project that we have partnered with Harvard and the League nationally now. We will be discussing democracy and women's rights in America, and that will be done in line with the Harvard Case Method approach. And that will be held at the Greenwich High School, conducted by Greenwich High School teachers, and we will also have participants from leagues around the country. So we're excited about that. Please join us for that. Again, we thank you all for your support. We encourage you to support our partners, WNYC, the Greenwich Library, and of course, the League. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, and thank you.